Racist judge finds black man, then learns he's a federal prosecutor. Welcome to today's story of courage, determination, and the battle against systemic bias. Before we begin, please share your location in the comments below. We enjoy hearing from our global audience, so feel free to join in. On a warm morning in Greenville, South Carolina, at 8:42 a.m., seasoned federal prosecutor Richard Robinson parked outside the municipal courthouse. Dressed in a sharp navy suit and white shirt, he took a deep breath, disliking the thought of being late. His professional life revolved around discipline and preparedness, but today, a mix of personal and professional hurdles had thrown him off track. An urgent phone call about a human trafficking case had delayed him, but he still managed to collect his evidence for a simple task, challenging an error in a property tax adjustment on his grandmother's house. To Richard, this wasn't just property. It was the anchor of his childhood, a place that carried the legacy of his family. As he approached the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant: "The judge has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful." Richard shook it off. Facts were his weapon, and he came prepared. But something about the warning lingered. Stepping inside, Richard was greeted by the worn but bustling municipal courthouse. Unlike the polished federal courts where he spent most of his days, this place felt ordinary: beige walls, scuffed seats, and a faint smell of old coffee. The room was alive with people clutching documents, their faces tense with anxiety over parking tickets and small claims. He quickly found the courtroom marked 204, with the name Judge Charles Whitman etched in brass. Richard adjusted his tie and stepped inside. The judge, a tall man with piercing blue eyes and an imposing demeanor, commanded the room without uttering a word. Richard noted how the judge's gaze swept over the room, missing nothing, or perhaps deciding what was worth noticing. Richard's case was called at 9:15 a.m. Though he was only a few minutes late, he approached the podium calmly, evidence in hand. "You're late, Mr. Robinson," Judge Whitman said sharply. Richard responded respectfully, explaining his delay due to federal matters, but the judge cut him off. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness. This court operates on order and respect." With a dismissive wave, he declared a $750 fine for contempt. Richard's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. Around him, murmurs rippled through the courtroom. What struck him was the glaring disparity. Just minutes earlier, other latecomers had entered unnoticed, one even scrolling casually on her phone. Yet Richard was singled out. Richard returned to his seat, his mind racing. As the courtroom moved on, he couldn't ignore the tension that had settled over the room. He noticed subtle but telling reactions from others: a knowing glance from an older black man, the discomfort of a clerk typing away, and the silent approval of a young law student scribbling furiously in her notebook. This wasn't just about tardiness. This was about something far deeper. Richard began jotting notes, his legal instincts kicking in. He wasn't just a prosecutor today. He was an observer, a witness to something that felt systemic. When Richard's name was called again, he rose with deliberate calm. Presenting his case, he meticulously laid out the discrepancies in the property tax adjustment, pointing to clear evidence. Yet the judge's demeanor remained dismissive. "Do you believe your federal responsibilities justified disrespecting this court?" Judge Whitman asked. "Your Honor," Richard began, his tone firm but respectful, "I understand the importance of rules. But I must ask, are these rules applied equally to everyone in this courtroom?" The air in the room grew heavy. The judge's face reddened, and his gavel came down hard. "I will not tolerate accusations against this court. Your fine stands." Richard inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. But as he returned to his seat, the weight of his observations became a quiet resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. As the session ended, the courtroom had emptied, but Richard remained seated, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and calculations. The fine wasn't the issue. It was the principle. He had spent his career upholding justice, and today, he had seen it undermined in broad daylight. The disparity in the judge's treatment couldn't be ignored. As the clerk began organizing her desk, Richard approached her. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Can I request a transcript of today's proceedings?" The clerk hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting nervously toward the judge's bench. Then, with a quick nod, she handed Richard the necessary forms. "You'll need to submit these," she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was something in her expression, a mix of fear and quiet support, that only solidified Richard's resolve. Leaving the courthouse, Richard pulled out his phone and typed a detailed memo, documenting every moment of the hearing, the comments, the fines, and the silent but telling reactions from others in the room. This was no longer about his grandmother's property taxes. It was about exposing a pattern of bias. Back at his office, Richard began piecing together a case. He requested public records of Judge Whitman's rulings, focusing on fines and penalties issued over the past 5 years. The data painted a damning picture. Black defendants were fined significantly more than their white counterparts for similar infractions. The disparities weren't just anecdotal, they were systemic. Richard also reached out to colleagues and community members, many of whom had appeared in Whitman's courtroom. The stories they shared were strikingly similar. A black woman fined excessively for contesting a parking ticket. A young black man berated publicly for being late, while white defendants received little more than a passing remark. The pattern was undeniable. As Richard dug deeper, the story began to gain traction. A young law student who had been in the courtroom that day posted about the incident on social media. Her account quickly went viral, sparking outrage and prompting others to share their experiences. Within days, local news outlets picked up the story. Headlines read, "Bias in Greenville Courtroom, Federal Prosecutor Speaks Out." Community leaders and activists joined the conversation, organizing rallies and demanding an investigation into Judge Whitman's conduct. The courthouse steps became a hub of activity, with protesters holding signs that read, "Justice for All" and "End Courtroom Bias." Richard kept a low profile, focusing on building an airtight case. But the momentum was undeniable. This wasn't just about one judge. It was about a system that had allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. 1 week after the initial hearing, Richard received a call from his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Richard, we've reviewed your findings," she said. "This is bigger than we thought. We're opening a formal investigation into Judge Whitman's rulings." The words were a validation of everything Richard had been working toward. But he knew this was just the beginning. The investigation would be lengthy and challenging, and the stakes were high. You want the next part of the story? Then type "yes" in comment section.